My son convinced my husband to divorce me at 74. We'll split all her property and $5 million in half. At 74, he took everything from me. I silently packed my suitcase and disappeared. But a week later, a notary knocked on their door with documents that changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that 52 years of marriage was proof enough, proof that a man loved you, proof that you had built something real, something that couldn't be undone by a bad season or a careless word. Raymond and I had weathered all of it. The lean years when he was building his contracting business from nothing, the loss of our second child before she ever drew a breath, the slow drift that sometimes comes in middle age when you look across the dinner table and wonder if you still know the person sitting there. We always found our way back. That was what I believed. Our home was a colonial on Birchwood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, the rose garden I had planted the summer our son Derek turned 3. Raymond had built that house with his own crews, and I had made it into the kind of place that people felt the moment they stepped through the door. Warm, settled, earned. We were comfortable, more than comfortable. Over 50 years, Raymond's business had grown into something substantial, and we had been careful with money in the way that people who once didn't have it tend to be. The accounts, the properties, the investments, it all amounted to something close to $5 million by the time we reached our 70s. We never spoke about it much. It simply existed, the way the house existed, the way our marriage existed. As a fact, Derek was our only surviving child. He was 51 years old, and I want to be honest with you. I had been watching him with a quiet unease for most of his adult life. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't. Not openly, but because of the way he calculated, the way his eyes moved when money was mentioned. He had his father's jaw and his father's confidence, but underneath it was something that didn't belong to Raymond at all. A kind of patience that wasn't really patience. It was waiting. He had never been good with his own finances. 2 failed businesses, a divorce that cost him significantly, a lifestyle that always seemed to exceed what he earned. Raymond bailed him out more than once. I said little. You don't want to be the mother who poisons her husband against his son. So I watched, and I said little, and I told myself it would be fine. The first sign came in February, about 8 months before everything broke open. Derek started coming around more. That alone wasn't unusual. He lived 40 minutes away in Weaverville, and he had always visited on Sundays. But these weren't Sunday visits. He was coming on Tuesday evenings, on Thursday afternoons. And when he came, he and Raymond would sit in Raymond's study with the door closed. Raymond had never been a man who closed doors in his own house. I didn't ask directly. I brought them coffee once, and Raymond looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And Derek shifted in his chair in a way that I recognized. The way a person shifts when they've been talking about someone who just walked in. I set the coffee down and left. I stood in the hallway for a moment outside the closed door, and I thought, something is happening in there. Over the following weeks, Raymond became quieter with me, not hostile. Raymond was never a man who raised his voice. But there was a new distance, as if he were measuring his words before he offered them. He stopped asking my opinion about things he had always asked me about. The investment accounts, the property taxes, the question of whether to sell the lake cabin up in Tennessee. These had been joint conversations for decades. Suddenly they weren't. I began to notice other things. Raymond started taking phone calls in the garage. He changed the password on the desktop computer in the study. Small things. The kind of things a woman of 74 might be tempted to dismiss as paranoia, as the fearfulness that comes with age. I was tempted. I nearly gave in to that temptation. Then came the morning of October 14th. It was a Wednesday. I had made breakfast, eggs, toast, the grapefruit Raymond had taken every morning for 30 years. He sat down, moved the food aside without eating, and folded his hands on the table. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone they have already mentally left. "Martha," he said, "I want a divorce." I heard the words. I understood them. But for a long moment, the kitchen felt very far away, as if I were watching the scene from somewhere above it. "I've spoken with an attorney," he continued. His voice was steady, rehearsed. "I think it's the right thing. We've grown apart." Grown apart? 52 years. The baby we buried. The house on Birchwood Lane. The rose garden. Grown apart. I looked at him across the table, and I did not cry. I am not sure why. Perhaps because somewhere beneath the shock, some older, quieter part of me had already known this was coming. Had known it since February, since the closed doors, since the shifted chair. "All right," I said. I got up, washed my plate, and went upstairs. And I began, very quietly, to think. I sat on the edge of the bed in our room. My room, I was still calling it that. And I let myself feel it. Not the grief. Not yet. The grief would come later, in waves, at unexpected moments. The smell of his coffee in the morning. The particular way he cleared his throat before speaking. What I let myself feel right then was the fear. Clean, practical fear. The kind that tells you to pay attention. What did I actually have? We had been married in 1972, before North Carolina's equitable distribution laws had been fully shaped. But those laws had evolved over the decades, and I knew, in a general way, that a long marriage entitled both spouses to a fair share of marital assets. What I didn't know, what I had never had reason to examine closely, was exactly how those assets were structured, whose names were on what, which accounts had been opened when and by whom. Raymond had always managed the finances. I had been involved in the broad strokes, the major decisions, but the paperwork, the accounts, the precise architecture of our wealth, that had been Raymond's domain, and I had let it be. That, I realized sitting on the edge of that bed, had been my single greatest mistake. The house on Birchwood Lane, I believed it was in both our names. The lake cabin in Tennessee. I was less certain. The business, which Raymond had sold 8 years ago for a substantial sum, had generated investment accounts that I had seen statements for but never examined closely. There were also Raymond's pension accounts, the proceeds from 2 rental properties he'd sold in the 1990s, stock holdings I knew existed but couldn't have named precisely. $5 million, give or take. And I had let a man I trusted hold all of it in his hands. The question that kept returning, the one I couldn't push away, was, how much of this had Derek planned? Because I didn't for one moment believe that Raymond, at 76, had woken up one morning and decided to dismantle 52 years of marriage on his own. Raymond was many things, but impulsive wasn't one of them. Someone had worked on him. Someone had spent months sitting in that study with the door closed, building a case, reframing decades of shared life as something to be escaped. My son had convinced my husband to leave me. I said it to myself plainly, without softening it, because I needed to feel the full shape of the thing I was dealing with. I spent the rest of that Wednesday in a kind of controlled stillness. I did not confront Raymond. I did not call Derek. I went downstairs at lunchtime, made myself a sandwich, and ate it at the kitchen table while Raymond was out. In the afternoon, I drove to the public library on Pack Square. Not the nearest branch, not the one where the librarians knew my face. And I used one of their computers to search for family law attorneys in Asheville. I was looking for a woman. I can't fully explain why, except that I knew what I was walking into was going to require someone who understood, without my having to explain it, what it meant to have trusted a man for 50 years and find yourself holding nothing. I found her, Patricia Holloway, of Holloway and Crane family law. 23 years of practice, a particular focus on asset division in long-term marriages. I wrote down her number on a slip of paper, put it in the inner pocket of my cardigan, and drove home. That night, Raymond and I had dinner in near silence. He asked if I wanted more water. I said no, thank you. We watched the evening news separately. He in the study, I in the sitting room, and went to bed at different times. I lay in the dark and listened to the unfamiliar sound of my own house, and I made myself a promise. I was not going to disappear quietly. The next morning, while Raymond was at his Thursday golf game, I called Patricia Holloway's office and made an appointment for the following Monday. I told the receptionist it was urgent. She gave me a 9 a.m. slot. I spent the weekend being careful. I acted as I always had, made meals, tended the garden, asked Raymond about his golf game. I also, quietly, began to gather. I went through the filing cabinet in Raymond's study when he was napping, photographing documents with my phone, bank statements, property deeds, investment account summaries, the mortgage documents paid off 15 years ago, an LLC filing I didn't recognize, dated 3 years back, with Derek's name on it alongside Raymond's. That last one made my hands go cold. An LLC, formed 3 years ago, that I had never been told about. I photographed every page and went back to the sitting room and sat very still for a while. By Sunday evening, I had the outline of a plan. It wasn't complete. There were things I didn't understand, things I would need Patricia Holloway to explain to me. But I knew its shape. I was not going to accept whatever Raymond and Derek had arranged. I was going to find out exactly what existed, and I was going to protect what was mine, and I was going to do it before anyone realized I had started. The appointment was Monday at 9 a.m. I set my alarm and went to sleep. Patricia Holloway's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. The kind of office that was deliberately understated. Clean lines, good light, no excess. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a manner that was precise without being cold. She looked at the photographs I had printed at the library that morning, spread them across her desk one by one, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How much of this did you know about before last week?" "Almost none of it," I said. She nodded, as if this were not surprising. "The LLC," she said, tapping the filing I had photographed in the study. "This is a real estate holding company. It was formed 3 years ago. Your name is not on it." "I know. Were any marital assets transferred into it?" "I don't know," I said. "That's what I need to find out." She told me what she could do and what it would require. A formal discovery process, once divorce proceedings were underway, would compel Raymond to disclose all assets. But she also recommended that I act quickly on several fronts before that process began. Specifically, that I consult with a separate estate attorney about my own documents, and that I begin gathering any financial records I could access legally and immediately. She also told me something I hadn't fully understood. In North Carolina, assets that were transferred out of marital property within 3 years before a divorce filing could potentially be subject to challenge depending on the circumstances and intent. 3 years? The LLC had been formed 3 years ago. I drove home steadier than I had been in days. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know until later, was that Raymond had noticed the filing cabinet was slightly out of order. He was a precise man, and he kept his papers in a specific arrangement. When he opened the cabinet that Monday morning and found the folders fractionally shifted, he knew. He didn't say anything to me. He called Derek instead. I found this out eventually. At the time, I only noticed that Raymond seemed watchful at dinner that evening. His eyes rested on me a moment too long. I kept my face still and talked about the garden. The following Thursday, I had my second appointment with Patricia, this time accompanied by a fuller set of documents. I had found, tucked in the back of a folder marked insurance 2019, a set of bank statements for an account I had never seen before, a savings account, opened in Raymond's name only 8 years ago, the same year he sold the business. The balance, as of the most recent statement I had found, was just over $400,000. A second account, a brokerage, had been opened the following year. Another name was listed as beneficiary, Derek's name. Patricia looked at the statements and then at me. "This account predates the LLC," she said carefully, "but it's still something we'll want to examine closely in discovery." I left her office and sat in my car in the parking garage for several minutes. I wasn't crying. I was past crying. I was moving through something harder than grief now, something that had a different texture. It was the feeling of a person who has been standing on ground they believed was solid and has looked down to find it has been slowly undermined for years. How long had Derek been planning this? How long had Raymond been willing? That afternoon, I drove not home, but to the Radio Shack on Merriman Avenue. It was still there, barely, in those days. And I bought a small digital recorder. I wasn't sure what I intended to do with it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I drove home and put the recorder in my cardigan pocket. I didn't have to wait long. That Saturday, Derek came for one of his now frequent visits. He and Raymond went to the study as usual. I made coffee, carried it down the hall, and stopped outside the door. My hands were steady. I had not planned what happened next, or perhaps some part of me had, in the way that the body sometimes knows before the mind catches up. I pressed the recorder. I stood in the hall for 6 minutes. The sound quality was imperfect, muffled through the door, but it was enough. Derek's voice, slightly louder than Raymond's. "She doesn't know about the Tennessee property transfer, does she? As long as we file before she gets an attorney, the 60-day window means the LLC holds enough that even with equitable distribution she ends up with." And Raymond's voice, quieter, a voice I had loved for 52 years. "She won't fight it. You know how she is. She won't fight it." I walked back to the kitchen. I set the coffee tray down. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the rose garden, the one I had planted when Derek was 3 years old, and I felt something settle in me. Not rage, not grief. Something colder and more useful than either. They thought they knew how I was. They were about to learn otherwise. Patricia had advised me to move carefully and in sequence. The first step, she said, was to secure my own independent documentation, to ensure that whatever assets were legitimately in my name or jointly held were properly recorded and that I had legal standing to access them. The second step was to file a formal response to whatever Raymond's attorney initiated. The third, and this required a separate consultation which she arranged, was to visit an estate attorney named George Harlan, who worked 2 floors above her in the same building. George Harlan was a quiet man in his 60s with an old-fashioned courtesy that I found, in that particular season, extremely comforting. I brought him a copy of my existing will. Raymond and I had made wills together in 2009, straightforward documents that left everything to each other, with Derek as sole beneficiary after both of us were gone. And I told him I wanted to revise it. Completely. He asked me what I had in mind. I told him. What I had learned, through 2 weeks of conversations with Patricia and my own quiet research, was that I had more independent standing than Derek had apparently accounted for. The house on Birchwood Lane was in both names. Several of the older investment accounts, ones Raymond and I had opened together in the 1980s and 1990s, were joint accounts with right of survivorship. These were marital assets, subject to equitable distribution, and while I might not receive exactly half of everything, I was entitled to a fair share of the marital estate built over 52 years. What Derek had not counted on, what Raymond had apparently not told him, or perhaps had forgotten, was a separate financial decision I had made completely on my own. 11 years earlier. My mother had died in 2012 and left me, her only daughter, the proceeds from the sale of her house in Charlotte. $160,000. I had deposited it into an account in my name only, had invested it carefully and quietly over the years, and had never commingled it with our joint finances. Separate property. Mine alone. That account over 11 years had grown. I revised my will. I established a trust. I made specific designations that would not be easily undone or challenged. George Harlan notarized everything on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, and I drove home feeling, for the first time in weeks, like solid ground was somewhere beneath my feet again. I was not prepared for what happened 2 days later. I was in the kitchen on Thursday morning when Derek's car pulled into the driveway. He didn't knock. He had a key. Had always had a key. And he came through the back door with Raymond behind him, and they stood in my kitchen with the air of men who had rehearsed something. Derek said, "We know you've been to see an attorney." I said, "Good morning, Derek." "Mom." His voice shifted into something softer, practiced. "We should talk about this like adults. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Dad just wants—" "I know what your father wants," I said. "He told me himself." "The point is," Derek said, and the softness dropped, "that if you try to drag this into a long legal fight, the costs come out of the estate, out of both your shares. You're hurting yourself." I looked at my son. I thought about the recording in my cardigan drawer upstairs. I thought about the LLC. I thought about she won't fight it. "I appreciate your concern," I said. Raymond hadn't spoken. He was standing near the door with an expression I couldn't read. Not guilt exactly, but something uncomfortable, as though he had walked into a room and found it arranged differently than he'd expected. Derek's tone hardened. "If you push this, you should know that we have documentation showing that a significant amount of the household spending over the past 20 years was disproportionate. Attorneys can argue dissipation. Your spending on the house, the garden, Derek," I said very quietly, "I have an attorney. She is very good. I suggest that any further conversation about the legal specifics go through her." There was a silence in my kitchen that had weight to it. Derek looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at the floor. Then Derek said, more quietly, "You're making a mistake." And they left. I stood at the kitchen window again after their car pulled out. My heart was beating harder than I would have liked. But my hands, I noticed, were still. I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She advised me to document the visit, date, time, what was said, by whom. I did. Then she said something that mattered. "Martha, you've done what you needed to do. Now I need you to step back for a few days and let me work." "Can you do that?" I said I could. I packed a bag that afternoon and drove to my friend Eleanor's house in Hendersonville, 30 miles south. Eleanor had been my closest friend for 40 years. She had lost her own husband 6 years earlier, not to divorce, but to a heart attack, and she understood things without my having to explain them. I stayed with Eleanor for 4 days. We drank tea and watched old films and walked by the French Broad River in the November cold. I did not look at my phone any more than necessary. I slept 8 hours each night for the first time in weeks. When I drove back to Birchwood Lane on Monday morning, I felt rested. I felt ready. And I had decided something, quietly, during those 4 days by the river. I was going to see this through to the end. The call came on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after my return from Hendersonville. It was Derek, and he was using the voice again, the softer one, the one that had probably worked on Raymond over all those months in the closed study. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said. "I think we went about this wrong. Dad and I both agree that you deserve to be taken care of. We're not trying to leave you with nothing. We were thinking a settlement, outside of court, something fair. You keep the house. We liquidate some of the other assets and split them cleanly." You'd walk away with the home and something in the range of 800,000. You could live very comfortably. 800,000. Out of an estate that Patricia now estimated, based on what we had been able to document, at between $4.8 and $5.2 million. I let Derek finish. Then I said, "I'll pass that along to my attorney." "Mom?" A pause. "I'm trying to help you here." "I know you are," I said. I hung up and wrote down the time, the offer, and the exact language he had used. I sent the notes to Patricia by email within the hour. What Derek had offered, and I understood this clearly by then, was not generosity. It was a calculation. If I accepted 800,000 and the house, Raymond and Derek would retain control of the remaining 4 million or so, including whatever was in the LLC and the separate accounts. They were counting on my not fully understanding what I was entitled to, on my being frightened enough of a long legal process to take a fraction of what was actually mine. "She won't fight it." Patricia responded to my email within an hour. "Do not engage further directly. I'll send a formal response to Raymond's attorney." I put my phone down and looked around the sitting room. My sitting room, the one I had furnished over the course of 30 years, the reading chair by the window, the photographs on the mantel. My life was in this house. But I was no longer confused about what the house represented to Derek and Raymond. It was a line item, a way to get me to stop asking questions. It was also around this time that I called Lindy. Linda, everyone called her Lindy, was Raymond's daughter from his first marriage. She was 58 years old, lived in Raleigh, and Raymond had maintained a complicated, intermittent relationship with her since her parents divorced in the 1970s. I had always liked Lindy. She was forthright in a way that her half-brother was not. Derek had never liked her. I called her on a Thursday evening and told her, as plainly as I could, what had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Martha, I want you to know something. Derek called me about 2 months ago. He was asking about my inheritance expectations, what I thought I was entitled to from Dad's estate." I held the phone and let that settle. "He was mapping the field," she said, "figuring out who the obstacles were." Lindy drove up from Raleigh the following weekend. We sat at my kitchen table, and she told me what she knew, which wasn't everything, but was enough. Enough to confirm the shape of what I had already understood. Derek had been working on Raymond for at least 18 months. He had presented it, Lindy believed, as estate planning, protecting the assets from taxation, from complication, rationalizing the transfers as prudent financial management. Raymond, who was 76 and whose health had been quietly declining in ways I had noticed and worried about, had been susceptible in a way he might not have been 10 years earlier. "He's not a bad man," Lindy said about her father. She said it carefully, like she meant it, but was aware of its limits. "No," I agreed, "he isn't." We weren't making excuses. We were just being accurate. Lindy was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she was willing to provide a written account of Derek's call to her, what he had asked, and how he had framed it. Patricia said this could be relevant, depending on how things developed. It was not a smoking gun, but it was another piece of the picture. After Lindy left on Sunday afternoon, I sat in the garden for a while, even though it was November and cold. The roses cut back for the season, the beds covered in mulch. I had planted this garden the summer Derek was 3. He used to come out and hand me tools when he was small, not knowing what any of them were, just wanting to be near me. I thought about that child for a moment. Then I let him go. I had work to do. They came on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks before the first formal hearing date Patricia had scheduled. I had known, in a loose way, that another approach was coming. Derek was not the kind of man who accepted a closed door without trying it again. But I had not expected Raymond to come with him. Raymond had been communicating only through his attorney for over a month. I opened the front door, and there they both were on my porch, in the December cold, and Raymond was holding a poinsettia. A poinsettia. As if this were a social call, as if we were neighbors dropping by for coffee, as if the past 3 months had been a minor misunderstanding rather than a calculated dismantling of everything I had spent my adult life helping to build. I stood in the doorway and looked at them. "Martha," Raymond said, "could we come in? Just to talk." I wanted to say no. Every sensible instinct told me to say no. But I also understood something about how these things worked, that if I could hear what they said, I would know more than I did right now. So I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the sitting room, my sitting room, with the reading chair and the photographs. And Raymond set the poinsettia on the side table and folded his hands the way he had at the kitchen table in October. And Derek leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and they began. The approach was softer than the kitchen visit. That was the first thing I noticed. Derek talked about family, about what a long divorce proceeding would do to all of them, to the legacy of what Raymond had built. He talked about stress, my stress, pointedly, as though at 74 I should be thinking about my blood pressure rather than my financial future. He said the word dignity twice, in the context of settling things privately, among family, rather than in a courtroom. He spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing each word the way a man chooses his footing on ice. Carefully, with an awareness of what breaking through might mean. Then came the part that was meant to move me. Raymond said, "Martha, I know I've hurt you. I know this hasn't been handled right." He paused. "But I also think, at our age, what we both need is peace, not a fight. You've always been sensible. You've always known what mattered." I looked at my husband of 52 years, and I heard what he was actually saying underneath the words. Be sensible. Be quiet. Know your place. Don't make this difficult. They had dressed it up in the language of reconciliation, but what they were offering was still surrender. And the particular cruelty of it, though I don't think Raymond experienced it as cruelty, was that they were using the qualities I had genuinely possessed, my patience, my steadiness, my preference for peace, as instruments against me, turning my own character into the mechanism of my defeat. Derek said, "If you drop the counterfiling and agree to the original settlement terms, we're prepared to increase the offer. $1.1 million plus the house outright. No legal fees, clean division, done by February. $1.1 million, up from $800,000. Still less than a quarter of the estate." "And the LLC?" I said. Derek's expression shifted slightly. "The LLC holds business assets that predate the marriage in terms of—" "The LLC was formed 3 years ago," I said, "during our marriage, using funds that were part of our joint estate. Patricia has the documentation." There was a silence. Raymond looked at Derek. Derek looked at me with an expression I recognized. I had seen it when he was 12 years old and had been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. The same slight tightening around the eyes. The same fraction of a second where the mask slipped before he could reposition it. "We can discuss the LLC in the context of a full settlement," Derek said carefully. "That's all we're saying. Come to the table. Work with us." "I am working with my attorney," I said. "If you'd like to make a revised offer, have Raymond's attorney contact Patricia Holloway." Derek stood up. The calm was gone. "Mom, I have to tell you, you are making this so much worse than it has to be. You think you have something here, but you're a 74-year-old woman going up against—" He stopped himself. But we all knew what the end of that sentence was. "A 74-year-old woman," Raymond said. "Derek, a warning." Derek picked up his jacket. "I hope you think hard about what you actually want," he said to me, "because what you're doing is going to leave everyone worse off, including you." He went to the front door and I heard it close behind him. Not a slam, which might have been easier to dismiss, but a firm, deliberate click. The sound of a man who believes he has said the final word. Raymond stayed for a moment. He looked at the poinsettia. He looked at me. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. The two of us at our 30th anniversary, the restaurant in Charleston, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. Then he looked at me again, and for just a second, I thought I saw something in his face that might have been shame. Not regret for the plan itself, perhaps, but regret for the particular way it had just been revealed. The stripped-down version of it, standing in a room full of our shared history, with his son's unfinished sentence still in the air. Then he got up and followed Derek out the door. I sat in the sitting room after they left and listened to the sound of their car reversing down the driveway. The poinsettia sat on the side table. I looked at it for a long moment, red and incongruous and utterly beside the point. And then I became aware that my hands were trembling slightly. Not from weakness, but from adrenaline, from the particular physical response to sustained threat that the body cannot entirely suppress no matter how still you keep your face. A 74-year-old woman. I let that sentence do what it was going to do inside me. I let myself feel the fear of it. The fear of being dismissed, outmaneuvered, made irrelevant. The fear of the legal costs, the timeline, the uncertainty. The fear of sitting in that courtroom and having a stranger read documents that quantified my 52 years of marriage into columns and figures. The fear, underneath all the others, of being wrong, of having misjudged what I had and what I was owed. And then I picked up my phone and texted Patricia. They came. I have notes. Can we meet Monday? Her response came within minutes. I'll be there. You did exactly right. I put the phone down. The trembling had stopped, and the fear, I noticed, had not disappeared. It had changed into something else, something with more weight to it, more traction. I had felt it before, in smaller versions throughout my life. The feeling that comes when you have been told you cannot do something and discovered somewhere in your body that you absolutely can. That the word cannot has been placed in front of you not as a fact, but as a test. And the test has a correct answer, and you know what it is. The first formal hearing was 3 weeks away. I went to the kitchen, moved the poinsettia to the counter where I wouldn't have to look at it, and made tea. And I began, very quietly, to prepare. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in January at the Buncombe County Courthouse on College Street. Patricia had spent the preceding 3 weeks in intensive preparation, and so had I. George Harlan had finalized all documentation related to my trust and revised estate planning. Patricia had filed our formal discovery responses and, more importantly, had filed a motion challenging the asset transfers into the LLC on the grounds of potential dissipation of marital assets, a legal term that I had not known 3 months ago and now understood precisely. Raymond's attorney, a man named Caldwell, efficient and expensive-looking in the way of men who bill by 6-minute increments, had filed a counter-motion arguing that the LLC represented legitimate business restructuring and predated any marital discord. Patricia had a response ready for that, too. What Caldwell did not know, and what Raymond and Derek presumably had not told him, was the recording. Patricia had spent considerable time with an audio specialist and a legal consultant working out exactly how the recording could be introduced and what it could support. North Carolina is a one-party consent state for recording. I had been present in the hallway, I had not been trespassing in my own home, and the recording captured a conversation to which I was effectively a party by physical proximity. It was not perfect. Nothing in real legal proceedings ever is. But it was enough to support a serious argument that the transfers into the LLC had been made with deliberate intent to reduce my share of the marital estate. Enough to demonstrate that the framing of this divorce as a mutual, natural conclusion to a long marriage was not the full picture. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. A charcoal wool suit I had owned for years, a strand of pearls that had been my mother's. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment and looked at myself. 74 years old, steady-eyed, wearing my mother's pearls in a courthouse in January. And I thought, this is exactly where you are supposed to be. I was not trying to perform anything. I simply wanted to look like what I was, a woman who had been married for 52 years and who knew exactly what she was owed. The hearing room was smaller than I had expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the particular stillness of official proceedings that reminds you, usefully, that this is a place where consequences are real and permanent. Raymond came in with Caldwell and sat across the aisle. He did not look at me when he sat down, which told me something. Derek was not present. He was not a party to the divorce, technically. But I saw him in the corridor when I arrived, standing near the water fountain with his arms crossed, and our eyes met for a moment. He looked as though he had not slept well. I held his gaze for 2 full seconds, and then walked past him into the hearing room. The hearing began with procedural matters. Caldwell presented Raymond's position, an equitable division of documented marital assets, with the LLC excluded on the grounds that it was a separate business entity formed for legitimate estate planning purposes. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who has delivered similar arguments many times and expected the framework to hold. He cited precedents. He was thorough. He was also, I was about to learn, unprepared. Then Patricia stood up. She presented our documentation methodically, without drama, in the tone of a person who has the facts on her side and knows that facts do not require ornamentation. The joint accounts, their opening dates, their balances at the time of the LLC's formation, the property deeds, the timeline of the LLC's creation, cross-referenced precisely against the sale of Raymond's business, the business whose proceeds had seeded the accounts from which the LLC had been funded. She presented Lindy's written account of Derek's call, noting that it demonstrated a pattern of deliberate planning that predated any claimed marital discord by over a year. She presented a forensic accountant's preliminary analysis with specific figures and transfer dates, not estimates, but documented transactions, showing that assets had been structured specifically to minimize my share of the marital estate. And then she presented the recording. Caldwell objected immediately, citing relevance and the circumstances of the capture. The judge, a woman in her early 60s named Judge Paris, with reading glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who has heard every version of every argument, listened to the objection, listened to Patricia's response, and then listened to the recording herself through headphones, in silence, twice. The courtroom was very quiet while she listened. I watched her face and learned nothing from it, which I took as a professional compliment to her. Then she made a note and asked Caldwell if he would like a brief recess for consultation with his client. Raymond and Caldwell stepped out. I sat at our table and looked at the wood grain of the surface in front of me and breathed. Patricia poured a small cup of water from the carafe and set it in front of me without comment. I drank it. Outside the high windows, I could see a strip of January sky, pale gray and entirely indifferent to the proceedings below it. They were gone for 11 minutes. When they returned, Raymond's face had a quality I had not seen on it before. Not the measured distance of the past months, not the rehearsed calm of the kitchen in October, or the calculated gentleness of the December visit with the poinsettia. This was something more exposed, something that had not been prepared for. He looked, I realized, like a man who had been told that the floor he was standing on was not as solid as he had been promised, and who was now doing the silent arithmetic of exactly how far down the drop might be. Caldwell asked for another recess, a longer one, 3 days, to review the new evidence and consult further with his client. Judge Paris granted it with a measured look that suggested she had a reasonable idea of what the consultation would involve. In the corridor afterward, Derek was still there. He had clearly been told something because his posture had changed. He was no longer leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He was standing upright, very still, with the look of a person who is trying to reconstruct a sequence of events and finding the reconstruction uncomfortable. "You recorded us," he said. "I was in my own hallway," I said. "That's—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Do you understand what this looks like? You were spying on your own family." I looked at my son. This man who had sat in my husband's study for months, patient and systematic, dismantling something I had spent 52 years building, who had called Lindy to map the inheritance field, who had stood in my kitchen and calculated that the offer of $800,000 was enough to make me disappear quietly, who had said, in a room he believed was private, the 4 words that had clarified everything. "She won't fight it." "Derek," I said quietly, "I know exactly what this looks like." I walked past him and out into the January air, and Patricia fell into step beside me, and neither of us said anything for half a block. The cold was sharp and clean and real. Then she said, "The 3-day recess is good for us. Caldwell knows the ground has shifted. The question now is whether Raymond accepts a real settlement, or we go back in front of Paris." "He'll settle," I said. "What makes you sure?" I thought about the look on Raymond's face when he came back into that room. The exposed look. The look of a man who had genuinely not expected to find himself accountable in quite this way. "Because he's not a bad man," I said. "He just made a very bad decision, and somewhere in there, he knows it." Patricia glanced at me. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one," I said, "and either way, it doesn't change the outcome." We walked back to her office in the January cold, and I felt, for the first time in 3 months, the specific relief of a person who has been moving through uncertain terrain in the dark and has finally reached a place where she can see clearly in all directions. Raymond's attorney called Patricia on the 2nd of the 3 recess days. They were willing to settle. Properly this time. Not the $800,000, not the $1.1 million, but a genuine accounting of the marital estate in full, including the assets held in the LLC, which Patricia's forensic accountant had now traced in their entirety. The negotiation took 2 weeks. I want to be accurate about this. It was not a simple or comfortable 2 weeks. There were counterproposals that required firm responses. There were moments when Raymond's side pushed on specific asset valuations, and Patricia pushed back. There were phone calls and emails and revised documents, and I sat through all of it with a patience I had not known I possessed. In the end, the settlement agreement was signed on a Tuesday afternoon in late January in Patricia's conference room, with both attorneys present and both Raymond and I seated at opposite ends of the table. I received the house on Birchwood Lane, outright, with no mortgage. That had been settled years ago. I received 45% of the documented marital estate, which after full accounting came to just under $2.2 million. I received a portion of Raymond's pension income on a monthly basis, formalized and legally binding. And the LLC, the entity that Derek had apparently believed was the architecture of my exclusion, was unwound as part of the settlement, its assets folded back into the marital estate and divided accordingly. My independent account, the one my mother had left me, the one that had grown quietly over 11 years while Raymond and Derek were building their plans, remained entirely mine, untouched and separate. Patricia noted, with a small professional satisfaction that this account alone had grown to just over $400,000. My money, my mother's legacy. Raymond signed without speaking much. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just the hour. I felt no satisfaction in it, not exactly. What I felt was something more sober, the acknowledgement that a thing had happened and had been dealt with, and that I had not been erased. What happened to Derek requires its own accounting. He was not a direct party to the divorce settlement, but the exposure of the LLC, its formation, its funding, the transfers that had flowed through it, drew the attention of Patricia's forensic accountant to tax filings associated with the entity. She filed those concerns separately with the appropriate parties. I had nothing to do with what happened after that. But the LLC was a problem that did not end with my settlement. There was also the matter of Raymond's will. Raymond had updated his will during the months of planning. I learned this in discovery. He had made Derek the primary beneficiary of his remaining estate, removing Lindy entirely and reducing my inheritance rights to a legal minimum. Now, in the aftermath of the hearing and the settlement, Raymond was informed by Caldwell, and by the clear-eyed reality of what the recording had documented about his son's involvement, that he might want to revisit that document. Whether he did and what he decided was not my business. I had my own estate. George Harlan had seen to that. On the afternoon the settlement was signed, I drove home along the interstate and then turned off onto the familiar roads that led to Birchwood Lane, past the old church on the corner, past the Hendersons' farm with its white fence, and up the gentle slope to my house. My house now, in a way that had a legal clarity it had never quite had before. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment. The rose beds were still covered in their winter mulch. In 3 months, they would need to be uncovered, and the new season would start, and the garden would do what it had always done: put out leaves and buds and blossoms with an indifference to everything that had happened around it. Gardens are good that way. I went inside and made tea and sat in my reading chair by the window, and I allowed myself, for the first time in 4 months, to simply sit. Not to plan, not to gather evidence or review documents or brace for the next thing, just to sit in my own house in the winter light and be. Spring came slowly to Asheville that year, the way it often does in the mountains, tentative, retreating into cold for a week, and then advancing again, until one morning you go outside and the air has changed and you know it's real. I uncovered the roses in late March. It was physical work, the kind that requires you to be entirely present, and I was glad of it. The months following the settlement had their own adjustments. There was the strangeness of the house with only one person in it, the particular silence of rooms that had held 2 lives for decades. There were evenings when I sat with a book I couldn't concentrate on and let myself feel the loneliness, because there's no honest way through it except to feel it. But there was also Eleanor, who drove up from Hendersonville on alternate weekends and had strong opinions about which restaurants on Lexington Avenue were worth visiting. There was Lindy, who called on Thursdays and who had become something closer to a friend than she had ever been when I was officially her stepmother. She had her own complicated feelings about Raymond and about what had happened, and we talked about them honestly, which was more than either of us had managed before. In May, I went to Portugal. I had always wanted to go and had never gone. There had always been a reason not to, a schedule. Raymond's preference for driving vacations in the southeast. I booked 2 weeks in Lisbon and the Alentejo region, and I went. I walked cobblestoned streets in the spring heat, ate things I didn't know the names of, and sat by the Tagus River in the evenings, watching the light change on the water. What I came back to on that trip was that I did not regret the fight. Not for a single moment. The alternative, the 800,000 and the silence, would have been its own kind of disappearing, and I had decided in that kitchen in October that I was not going to disappear. Lindy told me on a Thursday call in June what she knew about Derek. The LLC's tax irregularities had resulted in a formal IRS audit. The investigation was ongoing, but Derek had already retained a tax attorney, and the costs were substantial. A relationship he had been in for 2 years, with someone who had apparently expected to benefit from his forthcoming inheritance, had ended badly in April. He was living in a smaller apartment in Weaverville, and, by all accounts, not doing well. I did not gloat. What I felt was something closer to sadness. Not for what he had lost, but for what his years of scheming had revealed about who he had become. The child who handed me garden tools when he was 3. I mourned that child. The man who sat in the closed study mapping my financial erasure was someone else entirely, and I had stopped being responsible for him. Raymond's health had declined more noticeably since the winter. He was living in a smaller house on the eastern side of Asheville, relying on a caregiver who came 3 days a week. I did not visit. I did not call. The door between us had closed, and I had accepted that. What I had instead was this: my house, the rose garden in full bloom by June, Eleanor on alternate weekends, Lindy on Thursdays, Portugal in my memory. A financial future genuinely mine, managed by an advisor Patricia had recommended, growing steadily. In September, I signed up for a watercolor class at the River Arts District. I had not painted since my 30s, and I was not very good. I went every Tuesday morning and sat at a long table with 7 other people of varying ages, and we painted bowls of fruit and light through windows and the river, and I found, to my own mild surprise, that I was happy. Not performing happiness, not working toward it, just present in it the way you can be when you have stopped spending your energy defending something you've already won. Looking back, the thing that strikes me most is how close I came to simply accepting it. They counted on me being too tired, too trusting, too old to fight. They were wrong. What I learned at 74 is this: knowing what you're entitled to isn't greed, it's dignity, and it is never too late to stand up for it. So I'll ask you directly, what would you have done in that kitchen, with the poinsettia on the table and 52 years suddenly up for negotiation? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. Thank you for being here.